Science. I'm Yvonne, Staff for Science for the Public, and I welcome you to Contemporary Science Issues and Innovations. Today, we discuss how the Food and Drug Administration, or FDA, is funded and the possible consequences for the quality and safety of our foods and medications. Our guest is Dr. Aaron Kesselheim, Professor of Medicine at Harvard Medical School and Director of Portal at Brigham and Women's Hospital. Dr. Kesselheim is one of the top medical and legal experts on the issue of FDA funding. Dr. Kesselheim, welcome, and thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be talking with you.
Okay, and there's a lot about the FDA in the news lately. So I think in general, the public is not aware of how that's funding and what the issue has become and so on. So that's why we're very grateful for your information today. Could we start with how the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, how that came to be in the first place? What was the background there? And what was the need for this regulation originally?
Sure. So the Food and Drug Administration arose over 100 years ago. Back then, there were a lot of medications that were sold by entrepreneurs and self-styled chemists, and there were a lot of problems with those in terms of their quality and the excessive claims that were made about what they could do. And so starting in the early 1900s, Congress created an organization that would provide some regulation and oversight of the prescription drug and food market. And then over the course of the next few decades, in response to public health crises caused by unsafe medications, back in the 1930s with a drug called elixir sulfanilamide, and then again in the 1960s with a drug called thalidomide, the Congress gave the FDA increasing authorities to evaluate the effectiveness and safety of drugs and to maintain quality standards relating to foods, to try to ensure that those products are sufficient, the drug products in particular are sufficiently safe and effective, and in addition, extended that authority to medical devices as well. And so since about the 1960s, the basic rules relating to FDA review of new drugs for their safety and effectiveness have remained in place. And and as a result of that, these days, when you go to the pharmacy to pick up a prescription drug, you can feel confident that that drug is very high quality, and that the FDA has reviewed the drug and provided an assessment that the benefits outweigh the risks for the approved indication.
Right. I want to come back to that in just a minute, but for the moment, it came up, it was going to regulate both foods. There were big issues with foods as well. One was milk, for instance, was practically poisonous back in that day, but a lot of false kinds of claims for medications and things and that provoked this. Now, so the drugs we'll concentrate on the drugs here, were tested for the safety and effectiveness also. And could you just give us a little idea here of how those tests are done? So we have animal tests, human tests, an idea there.
Sure. So again, starting in 1962, Congress gave the FDA the authority to review drugs and determine if they show substantial evidence that the drugs work based on adequate and well-controlled trials. And in the wake of that legislation, there developed a need for systematic, stepwise testing of investigational drugs in order to generate the evidence needed for FDA approval. And so these days, investigational drugs are tested in often over the course of many years, first in the laboratory and in animal tests, and then progressing to human tests first with, oftentimes in healthy volunteers to just get a sense of the pharmacokinetics of the drug, and then subsequently in larger trials in patients with the disease that the drug is trying to treat. So this stepwise progression of clinical testing of drugs provides the evidence that is then submitted to the FDA for the FDA to evaluate to determine what the benefits and risks of the drug are.
I see. And presumably some of these drugs may be tested after they're released to the market as well. Is that correct? There's some sort of follow-up on some of them?
Yes, I mean, the
Okay.
process of learning about drugs' effectiveness and safety doesn't end with FDA approval. And in fact, oftentimes when a drug is approved, the clinical tests are useful, but they don't provide a full picture of the drug,
Right. Okay.
of the drug's effectiveness or safety. For example, oftentimes certain populations of patients are left out of early stage of the investigational studies, like children or elderly patients or patients with certain kinds of comorbidities like kidney disease or liver disease. Those patients may not be included in those pre-approval trials, and so after the drug is approved, oftentimes there will be additional studies that are requested by the FDA, and then of course the drugs will be used in routine clinical care, and data will trickle in from those uses as well that might provide some feedback on whether the drug has the benefits that were expected in the trials, or whether or not the drug might have additional risks that we didn't learn about early on.
Okay, now, so there is this testing kind of protocol, or several of them, and so on. These are presumably tested by FDA scientists, but there's another thing that is of concern today. The original idea of the FDA was to make it independent from these pharmaceutical corporations and food corporations, but somehow this has changed over the years. What is that relationship? What's the tricky thing there about the FDA and big pharma, these big corporations in particular, please?
Well, just to make one clarifying point, those clinical trials that are done to lead to FDA approval, those are often done by investigators at academic medical centers and medical schools around the country, and those are often not done are not done by the FDA scientists. The FDA scientists review the data and evaluate the data from scratch to make an assessment of what to make their own assessment of what the data show. But the clinical trials are usually organized by the pharmaceutical companies or the investigators that they work with at academic medical centers.
So it's not quite independent from the pharmaceutical companies then. They've got a hand in that.
No, that's right. Oftentimes it's the drug companies that are funding those clinical trials. And this brings back to your independence point, which is exactly right, that if the pharmaceutical companies are running these trials, it is very important that the FDA as a regulatory entity be independent from pharmaceutical companies, given that they have to provide assessments of the data that are generated and submitted to them. And so, for many years, the FDA was fully funded by the government, but unfortunately, Congress, particularly in the 1980s during the Reagan administration, did not fund the FDA at the level that was necessary for the FDA to conduct all the important work that it does. And so, there were delays, and the FDA didn't function as efficiently as it could because it wasn't given enough funding by Congress. And so, starting in 1992, Congress passed a law to provide for user fees, which is when a drug company submits an application for an approval, it also submits a fee to the FDA to help pay for enough scientists to review the application. And so, that started in 1992, and these days about 40, and they have grown over time and expanded into other areas of the FDA. So it started with drugs, but now there are user fees related to medical devices and generic drugs as well. And currently, the user fees make up about 40% of the FDA's budget and about 80% of the FDA's drug review budget. Now, the FDA keeps user fees separate um, uh, from the salaries of the scientists at the FDA. So a particular scientist doesn't know which pharmaceutical company provides the support that supports his or her salary. But I think that the fact that the user fees make up such a large amount of FDA's funding has led to some controversy because on the one hand we need a fully funded and well-resourced FDA to be able to perform its vital functions and do it in an efficient time. But on the other hand, it has set up concerns that there might be undue influence that comes along with that funding from the industry.
Right, I'd like to get to that. I had started out asking you about the relationship at the more executive level of the FDA and Big Pharma, but we'll come back to that then. And as you pointed out here, we have this issue of user fees. Those user fees have increased over time. I need to get straight why Congress wasn't funding the FDA in the first place properly. Why was that? What was happening there? The
1980s was a very was a time that was characterized by a substantial deregulatory agenda
yes,
that was pushed by the people in charge of the executive branch in particular during that era.
yeah,
And as a result, their political the political leanings of the folks in charge at that time were not interested in providing substantial funding for the FDA and other parts of the government to conduct
right.
the necessary work that it did.
But it
Um,
continued past that time too, right? So that now the proportion of user fees is actually higher than what it started out for. So it's continued. Do you have an idea why that has been the case, that over all these years, that when we went through that, I guess, the neoliberal phase there, and that you didn't need regulation, and now we've been through it again, but this other thing has continued, so that there are a couple of things happening in terms of the presence or the power of the pharmaceutical industry in terms of the funding that does cover the testing, right?
I think you're right that it has continued since then, and in fact has grown since
Right.
then. And I think that there are a couple different reasons why that's happened. I think first of all, the pharmaceutical industry, which was initially skeptical of user fees, has I think grown to appreciate user fees and the fact that there's that the FDA does have the much more capacity to to conduct reviews in a timely fashion. And so I think the pharmaceutical industry supports the existence of user fees and the perpetuation of that model. And I think it's also the case that, congressional budgets through different Republican and Democratic administrations since the 1980s continue to not provide
Yeah.
enough funding that would provide necessary independent funding for the FDA, and so the need for user fees has continued as well. So I think that it is a combination of a lot of different things.
Right. Now, at the same time, we have what's called the revolving door situation in these regulatory agencies, that so that you have somebody very close to these corporations or been on the boards of these corporations and so on, then serves as the FDA director. And the present case is not the first time. I think it's just been called the revolving door. That's a lot of power, right, for the corporations. Do you think that these people are staying objective about the testing of these drugs in those cases?
Well, I hope so. I mean, I do agree that over time there have, and I am aware of the revolving door phrase, am also aware that over time, it has been the case that more leadership in the FDA have backgrounds in the pharmaceutical industry than before. I like to think that despite that when folks are working with the FDA, that they're fulfilling the mission of the FDA, which is to sort of advance the public health and promote the interest of the public health, and are not thinking about the pharmaceutical industry relationships that they had prior to being at FDA. And there are some rules in place around conflicts of interest that government employees hold to try to prevent direct conflicts of interest that would lead to specific concerns about specific decisions. So I mean, so I think that all of those are important considerations. But I think that I think in general your point that we need to be able to trust our leadership at FDA, and one way to do that would be to make sure that there is as much independence as possible from the regulated entity is an important part of that trust, and I think that that's why these issues are very important, and it's important to continue to talk about them and scrutinize them and try to ensure that we have an appropriately independent FDA.
On this concern about whether these products, I'm going to shift just a little bit because this is such a big issue these past couple of weeks, the drug issue, which we'll come right back to, but here is a case, and the reason for asking about the objectivity at the top is the recent baby formula case where a whistleblower actually submitted information to the FDA, but it didn't reach the top for several months, and we have a crisis, and the situation for that factory that produced the baby formula was really quite bad. So in that case, where was the FDA in all this time in terms of regulating that's a really serious problem.
I agree with you that it is a very serious problem, but I think that at some level, this controversy points to how important the FDA is, because it is the existence of the FDA and the regulation of, in this case, the baby formula market that helped ensure that an unsafe factory that was putting out toxic formula was shut down until those problems could be resolved, to try to ensure that we can feel confident about the baby formula that we buy in the supermarket. I think part of the issue, gets back to what we were talking about before in terms of resources, that in this case, the, vital function that the FDA is performing was not supported by enough resources. And as a result, there were inefficiencies and slowness in the regulatory response. And it seems like in response to that, Congress has very quickly gotten in gear to try to provide the FDA with more resources so that it can, maintain active and efficient oversight of baby formula production in the future. And I think that if there was more resources to begin with, and more transparency, maybe we would have seen this. In retrospect, we may have been able to see this kind of thing coming from more afar. So I guess I'm hopeful that those kinds of systems are instituted in the future, and that we can try to get this particular factory or other factories to make up for it back online as soon as possible, and get the supplies back up to where we need, and then learn from this episode for the future so that we don't run into these kinds of problems again. And I think it does come back to both adequate regulation, appropriate authority that the FDA would have to intervene at a in a short amount of time, and appropriate resources to implement that authority.
Yeah. You and your colleagues, several colleagues, wrote a very important article a few years ago that I was particularly interested in, about this user fee and the user fees, the gradual increase of this, and the possible conflicts that this could generate as a warning here. if you had your druthers, how would you fund the FDA? Would you say that this is the excuse for this user fee is it really expedites things? That's a good thing, but there are these downsides. If you could have your way, what would you do to fund the FDA?
Well, I mean, I think personally, I would say that the FDA should be funded fully by the government.
Yeah,
And I
yeah.
think that that would be the optimal way to fund the FDA. And actually, this is a very topical question that you're asking because the User Fee Act expires and has to be renewed every 5 years.
Yeah,
And
right.
Congress is currently debating the current User Fee Act renewal, which is expected to pass through Congress in August of this year and will be renewed for another 5 years. So I think that first and foremost, the FDA should be funded. So I think that ideally, for me at least, the FDA would be fully funded through the government. But I understand that that isn't the way that things are set up. And at least in the short term, we need to continue the user fees because that's the current system that we have for funding the FDA. But I think that we should be thinking long term in this issue and developing a strategy to wean the FDA off of user fees by increasing and guaranteeing, a certain levels of government funding that would provide the adequate resources for the FDA to conduct all its work in a maximally effective and efficient way, without having to rely on user fees to do that.
Right. Well, I ask this because this is an uncomfortable situation with executives that have this revolving door situation from corporations that have a vested interest in the testing, and they're contributing to the testing, and so you wonder who is really in control. So your point that it should be independent, completely independent, is well taken, and I'm assuming that is maybe the general perspective among professionals like yourself?
I don't know if I can speak for other professionals
Yeah.
like myself. I mean, I think that most people who study the FDA and I teach FDA law and
Yeah.
have published hundreds of papers on the FDA.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that most people who like myself around the country appreciate the importance of the FDA. I mean, the FDA touches a quarter of the economy and make sure that drugs and devices, which are some of the most important interventions in medicine, are sufficiently safe and can be trusted by patients. And so I think that most people recognize the importance of the FDA and the need to see it funded. I don't know if I can say if there's consensus on how that should be the case, but I think that the most important thing is that the FDA does have sufficient funding to do its critical work.
Yes. The other thing is, why is Congress lagging in understanding that? And it goes on. It doesn't matter which administration. I realize it probably goes up and down a bit, but it's been consistent over many administrations now that it remains underfunded, that the FDA remains underfunded, understaffed in general, when you need to be more and more careful today. Do you have any idea what's driving that? Indifference or something?
Well, I mean, I think that again, it's probably multifactorial. There certainly are a lot of demands on budgets and other demands from other sectors of the economy as well, and Congress people need to weigh those different options. As I said earlier, I think the pharmaceutical industry supports the idea of user fees, and the pharmaceutical industry has a very powerful lobbying
Yes.
arm, and that connects with both Democrats and Republicans
Yes.
in Congress, and so I think that also helps ensure that there is sufficient support for continuing the user fee model. I think it's probably there probably are other explanations that I'm not thinking of off the top of my head, but I think it is a very complicated issue, and but I think that if there is greater recognition about these issues, and if there are individuals that that get activated around this issue, and feel like reaching out to their congresspeople or senators around these topics. I'm sure that they would like to hear from them, and that could help build a movement in one direction.
Right, might have a citizen lobby, because coming up against the pharmaceutical lobby would be quite something. I'm not sure cards and letters would do the trick, but in any case, Dr. Kesselheim, how do we stack up compared to other countries? I know that Germany has had a problem. I don't know which country was the thalidomide problem that generated so much of this, which may not be familiar to the public, but maybe you could tell us something about, and how do other countries compare with this regulation?
Well, so you're right. The thalidomide crisis actually did start in Europe, and America was saved from the
Yes.
brunt of it by a very resourceful FDA scientist named Francis Kelsey, who, but the worldwide crisis related to thalidomide is what led to the most recent set of major reforms related to FDA. I think that the FDA sets the gold standard for the world in terms of its regulatory approach. And since the establishment of these rules relating to evaluation of drugs and devices at FDA, other regulators in other countries like the European Medicines Agency in Europe and Health Canada and regulators in Japan and other industrialized countries around the world have set up similar regulatory systems like the FDA. And they communicate with each other through harmonization meetings to try to make sure that there's best practices and regulation that are shared among the different regulators. I think that the FDA stacks up quite favorably with all of those different groups that all perform the similar vital functions for their communities as well.
Okay, so we're okay compared to the rest of the world. We're not slipping terribly. I know that we used to have at least other countries complain that our system was very lengthy, that the testing system and so on was very protracted, compared to some other countries. But in any case, before we close, I want to ask you about another recent one, and that is, now this is a chemical thing of the phthalates that I think the FDA has ruled that you can keep these, that these, like the fast food companies use these in their products, not the food part of it, but that the FDA has said it's okay, we can keep using those. Do you know anything about that?
I'm sorry, I'm not going to be able to answer that question.
Okay, that's okay.
But I do want to go back to something
Sure.
You just said in the kind of closing of the previous question. There is a kind of a historical myth that the FDA is a lot slower than in other countries, but and that may have been true 30 or 40 years ago. But in actuality, the modern FDA is among the fastest, if not the fastest, drug regulator in the world. So, I think that again, in terms of the speed and the effectiveness, the FDA stacks up, very well against other similar regulators.
Okay, and another thing there, I think is it true that on some of these questionable or drugs that maybe you would have complications down the line with certain populations with multiple conditions or whatever, there is, I'm not clear what this is, it's a black box warning on prescriptions. Can you tell us about that?
So for particular drugs, when there is a particular safety issue that needs substantial attention because it could lead to important morbidity or mortality for patients, companies and the FDA can work together to put that information in a black box at the top of the official labeling, and that is intended to try to provide greater attention to it for prescribers, so that they can then make sure that patients know about those issues. So a black box, what's sometimes colloquially called a black box warning, is the highest profile way that the FDA can try to communicate important risk information about drugs to patients. And it's supposed to be an alert to physicians about this particular safety issue, and something that they should talk about with
Right.
patients to determine if, even despite this risk, the benefits of the drug that might be expected are still worthwhile to provide the product.
Okay, that's. I just wanted to let listeners know, there is that kind of warning out there. I'm afraid that we have to stop at this time. This has been very good information. I really appreciate your giving your time for us today. Dr. Kesselheim, thank you very much.
My pleasure. Nice to be with you.
Okay, goodbye.